Also well known for the work that he does in anti-racism, especially in UU congregations. Donovan Hayden earned his master's degree in theater and performing arts at York University in October of 2020. He also presents his perspectives and experience through sermons in UU congregations. Let's listen to them now.
Greetings. On behalf of Donovan, myself, I thank the planners of this afternoon's national service for inviting us. I also want to thank the CUC staff and the Racism Study Group for the work they have done to educate and ensure an inclusive process for Canadian Unitarians in understanding the proposed eighth principle. I'm encouraged by the ongoing work of helping us all to live into the adopted eighth principle. Let me start by acknowledging my wife of nearly 30 years and Donovan's mother, Reverend Patricia Trudeau of the Unitarian Fellowship of Northwest Toronto. She has been step by step in our family's efforts of pushing a racial agenda within Canadian and U.S. Unitarians. In the last 3 years, we have brought that agenda individually and collectively in person or by Zoom to over 40 congregations and at 2 regional gatherings, as well as participate in CUC and UUA events and sessions. Though she's not on the podium, she is in attendance and is a valued member with Donovan and me on this journey. Both anti-Black racism and white supremacy are 2 conditions alive within Unitarian congregations in Canada. Too often, we want to define the 2 as in-your-face verbal assault or violence by white nationalists. Within congregations, these conditions have been suppressed and hidden while inflicting racial microaggressions and unintentional harm on Blacks from non-actions or denials. As a Black Unitarian, I have spoken out against these 2 conditions through talks and workshops. There have been times in congregation settings when I mostly remained silent out of the need to get along and not to offend, which often begs questions like, why am I here? Is it worth remaining a UU? Or will my presence make a difference when white supremacy is our default? At the CUC Black Lives Roundtable, June 22nd, 2020, I described personal incidents of racism and white supremacy within UU congregations in Canada. This afternoon, given the time I have, I will speak about the journey in respect to the harm leading up to the November 27 approval vote. In the early days of the proposed eighth principle process, I felt the public arguments and statements against it were strong enough to block it. I began to question my reason for remaining a Unitarian, as so many Canadian Unitarians appeared to be prepared to appear not to want to address concerns presented by Black and other racialized UUs. As the days and weeks moved on, I felt hopeful as more and more UUs began to push for the principle. I realized that the voices of many white UUs and racialized UUs were countering voices of those opposed. When 96% of the delegates voted yes, I knew that hope was alive. We could move our faith forward in dismantling racism in our congregation and society. Advocating for the eighth principle was a long road for me, having to endure painful and misinformed comments from fellow UUs. I would usually respond by asking, quote, give me one example of your congregation acting directly to dismantle racism within the congregation or society. Not charity, not good deeds or performative actions that don't create structural change. often response would deflect my requests or highlight the needs of other struggling populations which a congregation had embraced. I felt like there was a hierarchy of needs. Black concerns didn't seem to even be on the radar. I wondered if I was being heard as the focus on process became more important than a heartfelt cry for actions against racism and white supremacy. Black people have been waiting for our turn within our congregation and Canadian society. With the eighth principle, I believe there is hope. During the journey to approve, I had to wonder what people were thinking when they would say, quote, I'm not against the eighth principle because the issue was already covered in other principles, end quote. Or indigenous concerns is where our congregation is focused, end quote. Why can't we address more than one social concern at a time? I felt sharp pains from once again not being heard. The Canadian UUs listen to the messages coming out of the 2020 summer protests for racial justice? It hurt. I got an email from a UU who attended a talk Patricia and I had done on why the eighth principle was needed. The person asked me to help him understand the need for an eighth principle, followed by at least 2 email pages that mansplained and white-splained as to why it was not needed. Was he listening to our talk, or just there to provide counterpoints to support his already formed view? Ouch! It was reported to me by a member of a Sunday service committee at one of the congregations that a request was made not to have me return as a speaker, and I quote, because members of the congregation didn't need to hear any more concerns about race. We don't have a race problem in Canada, end quote. All I can say is, wow, there's a lot of work needing to be done with UUs. After a talk on personal encounters with anti-black racism and white supremacy in Canada, a UU member was quick to point out in the Q&A after the service that the things I had described did not happen in Canada. The now of my experiences seemed to be laced with anti-black racism and white supremacy. The person was coming from a place of racial entitlement and white privilege, giving her power to negate my experiences as a black person. It hurt. Folks, the eighth principle requires us to move beyond our past inactions and denials that have been harmful to me and other black people. Dismantling racism in ourselves and society means doing more and acting differently from how we have acted in the past in respect to anti-black racism and white supremacy. Thank you for being here.
Like many young UUs, during my teens, I stopped identifying myself as a Unitarian. I attended UU summer camps, but even my participation in those began to fade. I had no real investment in the faith and did not consider it my community. I had found community elsewhere in sports, theater, and social justice. In the summer of 2020, I took to the streets after George Floyd was murdered and began a new journey as an activist. At that time, I could not have imagined my blackness and my activism could find a home in the Unitarian Church. However, it was exactly those parts of myself and the subtle nudge of my minister mother that pulled me back into the faith. I suddenly found myself attending events, connecting with ministers, and speaking at congregations. I had spoken at UU congregations before, but this time felt different. Congregations were not asking for stories on how bad racism makes me feel, but wanting insight into how to be anti-racist. That was just it. Words like white supremacy and anti-racism seemed taboo when I left the church, but now were commonplace and encouraged. As I spoke, I learned more about UU's growing commitment to anti-racism and, of course, the eighth principle. Hold up. The eighth principle? The principle that was discredited a few years ago as a pipe dream of racialized UUs now had the potential of being adopted at a national level in Canada? I couldn't believe it, but it was true. I watched as staunch detractors turned into advocates. I could feel it in the air at every virtual service or event. There was something happening here. My sense was right. I was excited when the eighth principle was adopted at the special meeting back in November. However, I did not feel the joy that I had expected. When I connected with other racialized UUs, I started to understand why that was. They also expressed feeling wary and weary. The first hindrance to our joy is that we saw how the sausage got made. We put in long hours of work that required deep patience and exposed us to challenging situations at every turn. Secondly, we know there is a lot of work ahead. After the vote passed, we seem to all be in agreement. Today we celebrate, tomorrow we work. That is what we are here to do today. To celebrate the resilience of the racialized folks who led this fight, to recognize the collective growth of our faith in Canada through this process, and of course, to commemorate the years of work in adopting the eighth principle. But the work is certainly not over. Now that the CUC and congregations have adopted the eighth principle, it calls all Unitarians to put the principle into action by reckoning with our internal racism, being brave in our anti-racism work, and repairing and cultivating relationships with folks already doing the work in our communities. I know I am not alone as a young UU feeling both pride and anxiety over the eighth principle. Pride that it has passed, and anxiety that its promise will not be realized. However, I am committed to seeing this through. It is because of this engagement with social justice, anti-racism, and the valuing of Black people that I am even here today. For the sake of my generation and the generations to come, let us continue the work and live the eighth principle. Thank you.